It started with silence, just two strangers sharing a kitchen after midnight. But somewhere between the glances that lingered and the words left unspoken, something shifted. I didn't plan to fall for him. I didn't even know I could. But the moment our eyes met, everything changed. Julian Hayes had not expected to return to his childhood home at 35. After a drawn-out divorce and a quiet resignation from the university where he had taught literature for nearly a decade, the small, weather-worn house his mother still owned on the outskirts of town seemed like the only place left untouched by recent heartache. He arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon, the sky gray and low, his suitcase damp from the mist that clung to everything. His mother welcomed him without hesitation, warm but slightly distracted, and immediately apologized for the fact that the spare bedroom was already occupied. A tenant, she explained, a graduate student from the university. She had taken an Emery Lane a few months earlier to help with expenses, and because, as she put it, he seemed like someone who needed a place to land. Julian hadn't asked questions. He was in no state to care. It was later that evening, after unpacking and staring blankly at the ceiling of his old bedroom, that Julian finally made his way to the kitchen. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. The scent of black tea lingered faintly in the air, along with a trace of something warm and spiced. The kitchen light was on, and there he was, Emery Lane, sitting at the small table, notebook open, pen poised as if caught mid-thought. He was younger than Julian had expected, with a certain stillness about him, not the fidgety energy Julian remembered from most 20-somethings. Emery's hair was slightly damp, probably from a recent shower, and he wore a plain gray sweatshirt that hung loose on his slight frame. Julian nodded politely in greeting. Emery looked up, his expression unreadable at first, then softened with a polite smile. There were no introductions necessary. His mother had clearly already told him Julian would be moving in. Julian moved toward the kettle and filled it with water, each motion deliberate, quiet. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it carried a weight, a kind of awareness. Neither of them rushed to speak. He noticed the way Emery's gaze lingered for a second too long when Julian walked past. Not intrusive, but observant. Julian had felt it before from students, colleagues, even strangers in cafes. The quiet way some people watch the world without saying much, as if they're constantly trying to decipher something unspoken. The kettle began to hum, a soft, rising whistle. Julian poured hot water over a bag of chamomile and sat down across from Emery. The air between them seemed to shift, not tense, but charged with something neither of them acknowledged. It was a long moment before either of them spoke, and even then, it was nothing remarkable. A comment about the rain. A remark about the still unpacked boxes in the hallway. Their voices remained soft, cautious. It felt like both of them were gently tapping at the edges of something fragile. Later, as Julian lay in bed, the warmth of the tea still in his chest, he found himself thinking about Emery's eyes, how they seemed older than his age, like he had already seen too much. There had been no flirtation, no suggestion of anything inappropriate. And yet, Julian could not shake the sensation that something subtle had passed between them. Over the next few days, their interactions remained sparse. A shared nod in the morning, the sound of Emery's soft footsteps retreating down the hallway, the brief clink of cutlery when their schedules overlapped in the kitchen. Julian found himself oddly aware of the younger man's presence, even when they weren't in the same room. It wasn't attraction, at least not in the way Julian remembered it. It was quieter, rooted in something more elusive, curiosity, perhaps. Recognition, maybe. It was during one of those quiet evenings, the house dimly lit, rain once again tapping gently at the windows, that Julian walked into the kitchen and found Emery asleep at the table, head resting on his folded arms. A half-written page lay beneath him, ink-smudged. The sight was oddly intimate, and Julian hesitated before turning away to leave him undisturbed. That night, Julian didn't sleep. Not from restlessness, but from a strange stirring he couldn't quite name. It wasn't desire, not yet. It was the pull of familiarity, the way people sometimes gravitate toward one another without understanding why. He told himself it was just the proximity, the strangeness of living in such close quarters with someone new after so much upheaval. And yet, as the days passed, the space between them did not grow. It shrank, quietly, delicately, without either of them acknowledging it. There were no dramatic moments, just the slow, imperceptible folding of their routines around one another. Julian would come downstairs and find a coffee, already made. Emery would leave a book on the couch, and Julian would pick it up, read a few pages, then place it back exactly as it was. Their lives began to overlap in subtle, quiet ways, like brushstrokes blending at the edge of a painting. By the end of the first week, Julian realized he had started to listen for Emery's movements. The soft creak of the floorboards in the hall, the low rustle of notebook pages turning, the way he exhaled slowly before speaking. He was learning the rhythm of someone else's presence, and that, more than anything, was what unsettled him. The house settled into its usual silence each evening, the kind that stretched long after the dishes had been washed and the hallway lights dimmed. Julian often found himself wandering downstairs long after midnight, his footsteps light on the creaky floorboards, his mind restless. It had become something of a ritual, quiet moments in the dim kitchen, the sound of a spoon clinking gently against the sides of a mug, the smell of warm milk or herbal tea hanging softly in the air. He wasn't surprised anymore to find Emery already there. Sometimes the younger man would be leaning over his notebook, his brow furrowed, pen tapping thoughtfully. Other nights, he would be sitting in near darkness, the only illumination coming from the bluish glow of the microwave clock or the amber flicker of a candle on the table. He never seemed startled to see Julian, never asked why he was up so late. Their shared silence became its own form of communication, quiet, unforced, strangely intimate. Julian began to notice the little things. How Emery always folded his sleeves precisely to the same place on his forearms. How he chewed the inside of his cheek when he was lost in thought. How his voice, when he did speak, was low and deliberate, as though each word had to pass through several filters of reflection before leaving his mouth. It was easy to forget the age difference in those quiet hours. The world felt suspended, free from the rules and roles imposed by daylight. They weren't teacher and student, not landlord's son and tenant. They were simply two people awake when the rest of the house slept, slowly learning the shape of each other's solitude. There were moments that lingered, small, weightless things that should have meant nothing, but somehow did. The brush of their hands reaching for the same mug. The way Julian's name sounded when Emery said it without thinking, like it belonged in a different sentence entirely. The time they both paused in the doorway to let the other pass, only to stand awkwardly close, neither moving for a long, breathless second. Julian tried not to assign meaning to any of it. He reminded himself of how fragile he still felt, how easily loneliness could mimic connection. It had been years since he had let anyone in, even in friendship, and Emery, quiet, unknowable Emery, was not someone he should allow too close. And yet he found himself lingering. One evening, Julian entered the kitchen to find Emery curled up in the corner of the couch with a blanket draped over his legs, a book resting open on his chest. He had fallen asleep again, the steady rise and fall of his breath the only sound in the room. Julian stood there longer than he should have, his gaze tracing the outline of the younger man's face in the flickering lamplight. There was no justification for how deeply that moment settled into him. He made tea, deliberately quiet, letting the warmth of it spread through his hands as he sat at the far end of the room. He didn't wake Emery. Instead, he watched the shadows move along the walls, the slow dance of steam from his mug curling toward the ceiling. The room felt suspended in time, like something sacred and still. When Emery finally stirred, blinking against the dim light, he didn't speak. He simply looked at Julian for a long moment, his gaze unreadable but open. There was no tension, no awkward apology for falling asleep where he sat, just a kind of quiet recognition, as if the silence between them had grown roots. In the days that followed, Julian found it harder to retreat into the detachment he had carefully built for himself. Emery was there, always just beyond the edges of his awareness. His presence was like a note sustained in the background of a song. Gentle, steady, impossible to ignore. One afternoon, Julian came home early from a walk through town. The living room was filled with golden light, the windows open to let in the breeze. Emery was sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by open books, his headphones around his neck, a pencil tucked behind one ear. He didn't notice Julian at first, and Julian didn't announce himself. He just stood quietly, watching the way Emery's expression shifted as he read, curious, focused, alive. Something in that stillness unraveled Julian just a little. He wanted to understand the threads that made up this person, to know what kept him up at night, what made him laugh, what he had run from or toward before ending up here. But more than that, he wanted to preserve whatever it was that had begun to take shape between them. It felt delicate, like spun glass, beautiful, fragile, not to be rushed. That evening, their fingers brushed again, this time passing a bowl at dinner. Neither of them pulled away quickly. The contact was brief, unspoken, but neither pretended it hadn't happened. Julian saw the faintest flush rise in Emery's cheeks, but the younger man didn't look down. For the first time, Julian didn't look away either. Something had changed. Not dramatically, not overtly, but undeniably. The air between them had shifted again. It was no longer simply shared space. It was shared awareness. And Julian, who had once sworn he would never let anyone that close again, found himself silently wondering how it might feel to break that promise. There was a moment, not long after the warmth of spring had begun to stretch across the quiet neighborhood, when Julian realized he had started rearranging his schedule around Emery without even meaning to. He told himself it was coincidental, that his late-night reading hours simply matched Emery's study rhythm, that the timing of shared meals or evening walks through the garden had emerged naturally. But beneath that lie lived something unspoken and more difficult to deny. He wanted to be near him, not just in proximity, but in the quiet way they occupied the same space without pretense. It was a Tuesday evening. The sky outside was streaked with dusky orange and pale lavender. The house was unusually quiet, his mother having gone to visit a friend in another part of town. Julian returned from the grocery store to find Emery barefoot in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, washing a few dishes with slow, methodical movements. Music played faintly from a speaker on the windowsill, some instrumental melody that Julian didn't recognize, soft and melancholic. The scene struck him with unexpected force. Something about its simplicity, the domesticity of it, made his breath catch in his throat. Emery turned his head at the sound of the front door and offered a small smile, one that flickered just for a second before fading back into the familiar neutral mask he wore so often. Julian nodded and murmured a greeting, his voice nearly lost beneath the hum of the faucet. He moved into the kitchen with quiet steps, placing the grocery bag on the counter. For a while, they remained like that, side by side, speaking only in the quiet movements of shared space, passing utensils, folding towels, placing things in their proper places. And then it happened. Julian turned to hand Emery a glass that had just been dried. Their hands brushed, fingers grazing, and something passed between them, an almost imperceptible pause. Julian looked up, intending to say something benign, something to fill the space. But he met Emery's eyes instead, and everything stilled. There was nothing overt in the way Emery looked at him. No challenge, no flirtation, just a depth that pulled at something quiet and buried inside Julian, something he hadn't realized was still alive. It was a look that asked nothing and revealed everything, a soft unraveling of distance and pretense. Julian stood frozen, the glass still held loosely in his hand, suddenly aware of the sound of his own breathing. The silence between them stretched out, not uncomfortable, but heavy, thick with things neither of them had words for. Emery didn't look away. It lasted only a moment, a breath, a blink, but it rooted itself deep in Julian's memory, the kind of memory that doesn't fade with time but sharpens. The spell broke when the glass tilted slightly in Julian's hand and tapped against the counter. He turned, placing it down carefully, suddenly unsure of where to look or what to do. Emery didn't speak. He wiped his hands on a dish towel and quietly returned to his notebook at the table, as if nothing unusual had happened. But everything had changed. That night, Julian couldn't sleep. He lay awake, eyes fixed on the shadowed ceiling, the silence around him pressing close. He retraced the moment again and again. The way Emery's gaze had held his, steady and unguarded, how it had made him feel seen in a way he hadn't in years. There had been no hidden meaning, no intention. And yet, it had undone him. Over the next few days, their routine continued as it always had. Shared meals, late-night tea, the passing of books between rooms. But something beneath it had shifted. Julian began to notice Emery's presence more acutely. The subtle curve of his smile when he found a line he liked in a novel. The way he sat with one foot tucked beneath him, always angled slightly toward Julian. The faint hum he let slip when focused deeply. The glances between them grew longer. They rarely spoke about anything personal. Their conversations were about fiction, about music, about fleeting details of the outside world. But their silences were louder, more telling. Each pause between words felt like the echo of something they were too careful to name. One evening, they sat together on the living room couch. Rain tapped gently against the windows, and a candle burned low on the table. Julian was reading, or pretending to, while Emery sat beside him with his legs drawn up, head resting against the cushions. At one point, their arms brushed. Neither of them moved. Julian didn't know what it was that kept him still. Fear, maybe, or the strange comfort of not being alone in his longing. But he knew with certainty that what passed between them wasn't imagined. It lived in the shared quiet, in the careful choreography of closeness, in a glance that had changed everything. He wasn't sure what it meant. He wasn't sure if it could mean anything. But he knew that whatever unnamed thing had started to form between them, it was no longer something he could ignore. The night had wrapped the house in quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't just muffle sound but stretches time, slowing everything to a hush. Julian stood in the hallway outside the kitchen, staring at the soft amber glow slipping beneath the door. It was past midnight. The rest of the house slept, but he could hear the faint rustle of pages turning, the familiar rhythm of a pen tapping against paper. Emery was still awake. Julian didn't plan to go in. Not really. But his feet moved before his mind could stop them, and a moment later, he was standing in the doorway. Emery sat at the table, barefoot, a hoodie pulled over his head. His eyes flicked upward, and their gazes met. Neither of them said anything for a moment. They didn't need to. Julian stepped inside, the floorboards creaking gently beneath his weight. He poured water into a kettle without asking, setting it on the stove. The room smelled faintly of cinnamon and ink, a quiet warmth that felt strangely grounding. He didn't know what compelled him to speak, but the words came anyway, soft, careful, barely louder than the ticking of the wall clock. He mentioned how strange everything had felt lately, how sometimes it felt like he didn't recognize his own life, like something inside him had been pulled loose and left drifting. Emery didn't respond at first. He simply watched Julian with a stillness that felt more like understanding than silence. Eventually, he nodded once, slowly, as though acknowledging something unspoken. Julian kept talking about loneliness, about how routines could become armor, how sometimes being alone felt easier than risking connection, even when that loneliness became unbearable. He didn't name what had changed between them. He didn't speak of the glances or the touches, but the words hovered there anyway, just beneath the surface. Emery set his pen down and leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. But his eyes never left Julian's, and in them was something quiet and open, something that said, "I understand." Julian felt exposed under that gaze, not judged but seen. Fully, carefully, perhaps more than he had ever been. The kettle whistled softly. He turned away, grateful for the distraction. As he poured the hot water, he noticed the tremor in his own hands, barely perceptible, but there. When he sat down, the silence between them deepened, but not with discomfort. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. not because one intended to jump, but because the drop was beautiful and terrifying all at once. Their hands rested near each other on the table, not touching, just close enough to feel the warmth between them. Julian glanced down, then up again. Emery's gaze met his, calm and steady. There were no words for the current that passed between them. It wasn't about desire, not in the way people often assumed. It was about gravity, that quiet, undeniable force that pulled them into each other's orbit without permission. Julian wanted to say something meaningful, something that would make sense of everything. But all the words he knew, so many, after years of teaching and writing, suddenly felt too sharp, too obvious. So he said nothing. Instead, Emery moved first. Not boldly, not recklessly, just enough. His fingers grazed Julian's, not in a full touch, but a question. A silent, trembling question. Julian didn't pull away. The connection was brief, seconds, maybe less, but cracked something open, something honest. Their hands didn't clasp. Their bodies didn't move. But their silence deepened into something neither of them could pretend to ignore. Julian finally spoke again, but the words were barely audible. He said he didn't know what this was, that it scared him, that he hadn't expected to feel anything like this again, especially not now, not here, not like this. Emery's answer was quiet and measured, but it landed like thunder in Julian's chest. He didn't know either, but he didn't want to lose it, whatever it was. Julian nodded slowly, unsure whether he was more afraid of moving forward or staying still. They didn't kiss. They didn't reach for each other. There was no grand declaration or moment of clarity. Only the quiet presence of two people sitting across from each other in the middle of the night, recognizing the truth of what they had become to each other, without names, without definition, without certainty. When Julian eventually stood to leave, his hand lingered for a breath longer on the back of Emery's chair. It was the smallest gesture, but it held weight. In the hallway, the lights were dim, and the house once again fell into silence. Julian paused at the threshold of his bedroom, his heart still unsteady, his thoughts loud. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew, without question, that something had begun, something real, something that could no longer be ignored. Days passed, but nothing returned to how it had been. Not completely. The rhythm of the house remained unchanged to the untrained eye. Meals were still prepared, books still left open on tables, footsteps still echoed softly through the halls. But something in the atmosphere had shifted, quiet and irreversible. Julian found himself more aware of everything. The light that filtered through the blinds in the late afternoon. The way Emery stood with one hand on the counter, lost in thought. The lingering scent of his shampoo in the hallway. These small details began to form a pattern, a language all their own, one that spoke of closeness, of careful attention, of something deeper than either of them had dared to voice. They didn't talk about that night in the kitchen, not because it hadn't mattered, but because it had mattered too much. Some things Julian had learned existed best in silence, rooted not in what was said, but in what was known. And he did know. He knew it in the way Emery would glance toward him during breakfast, eyes soft but steady. He knew it in the way their hands occasionally brushed without retreating. He knew it in the strange sense of peace that settled over him when Emery entered a room. It wasn't infatuation. It wasn't fantasy. It was quieter than that and stronger. It was the recognition of something that didn't need to be rushed or defined to be real. One evening, they found themselves outside, just as the sun dipped behind the trees. The backyard was washed in amber light, and the distant hum of crickets had begun to rise. They sat side by side on the porch steps, shoulders almost, but not quite, touching. Neither of them spoke. Julian remembered a time in his life when silence had been something to escape, a void to fill. Now it felt like shelter, like truth. He thought about how much had changed since returning home, not just in his environment, but in himself. The person who had once walked through that front door, weighed down by exhaustion and guardedness, was not the same man who now sat beside Emery, quietly sharing the ending of a day. Emery leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze fixed somewhere in the fading light. Julian didn't watch the horizon. He watched Emery, the slight tension in his jaw, the soft fall of hair across his forehead, the quiet stillness that he carried like armor. And underneath it all, vulnerability. Not weakness, but presence. Openness. The same openness that had once startled Julian and now grounded him. As the sky darkened, Emery turned his head slightly, and their eyes met. No words were exchanged, just a glance, familiar now, full of the same quiet certainty that had once changed everything in the kitchen. Julian held that gaze, not to search for answers, but simply to be there, to stay. Eventually, Emery stood, stretching slightly, his movements unhurried. Julian followed a few moments later, and they walked back inside together. The house welcomed them with its usual quiet, as though it, too, had learned to carry their silence gently. Over the weeks that followed, they created a kind of rhythm, unspoken but solid. Sometimes they shared space in the same room for hours without a word. Other times, they exchanged brief phrases, simple acknowledgments of presence. There are no labels, no need to explain. What they didn't fit into tidy definitions. It didn't try to, and that was enough. There were still moments of hesitation, glimpses of uncertainty, of fear. Julian would wake sometimes in the middle of the night, unsure if he had imagined it all, if he had let himself feel too much, hope too openly. But every time he questioned, something always returned to steady him. The way Emery's hand would rest just slightly longer on his shoulder when passing by. The way his books began to appear alongside Julian's on the shelf. The quiet comfort of brushing teeth at the same sink without needing to speak. One night, as they sat together on the couch, the TV flickering in front of them with the volume low, Emery's head gradually leaned against Julian's shoulder. No grand gesture, no dramatic moment. Just weight, warmth, trust. Julian didn't move. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the quiet. He didn't know where this would lead, didn't know how the outside world would perceive it. But in that moment, none of it mattered. What they shared wasn't built on performance or declarations. It was something real, something slow and honest, and it didn't need to be explained. He rested his hand gently over Emery's, letting the silence between them speak the rest. And in that silence, they remained, two hearts learning how to belong, not in noise or certainty, but in stillness. Together.